I'm going to show you how to make bias binding strips, and the first step in the instructions is to make a square. So in this case I'm going to make a 14 by 14 inch square. I'm just trimming down the square now. So as you can see, we've got 14 by 14 inches and it's a square. So as it stands, this square, if we cut the strips like this, they won't stretch too much. If we cut the strips like this, they won't stretch too much. But if we cut the strips like this, we'll get a lot of stretch out of that fabric. So the aim of the game is that we actually want to be creating a straight edge that's at the diagonal. So because we have a square, and we're going to do it at a 45-degree angle, so what we do is we cut, because it's a square, from corner to corner. So I'm just lining it up, the ruler up with my corners. And I've cut the square across the diagonal. Now what we could do is actually like cut our strips and then join them up together, but we're going to end up with a whole bunch of tiny strips up here. So what we do is we're actually going to sew these two of the straight edges together. So what we're going to do is turn one over and then bring one of our pieces up like this. We're just going to line it up so that our edges match. We have the correct sides of our fabric facing each other, and we've got the straight edge, one of the straight edges matching. And so the way to figure out whether you've got it the right way is that it's never going to look like this as you sew it together. It's always going to look like this, with the 2 points at opposing sides. One thing I just wanted to mention before I stitched this together, I prefer to pin, number one, and number two, I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance when I stitch this in place. So I actually want to offset my triangles so that there's a tiny little bit of fabric poking out at each end, and I have offset it so that it sticks out about 1/4 inch past the straight edge of this triangle. So the tip of this triangle is sticking out about 1/4 inch of this triangle on top. The reason it's going to be 1/4 inch is because when I sew my seam at 1/4 inch, I'm going to hit exactly where the triangles overlap, and that's going to preserve a little bit of fabric. So now I've stitched it, and you can see that with 1/4 inch, by offsetting the little triangles, we're going to hit exactly on that corner. So now I'm going to go and give this a press it flat, and then I'm going to press the seam allowance open. So now that we've joined our two triangles, what we have is we've got a parallelogram. So just be mindful that this is cut on the bias, so that's likely to stretch. So when you're handling it, the bias tape, just be careful that you don't stretch it out and lose all the stretch. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cut our strips now, and we've got the bias, or the bias cut going along the strip, but we're going to be able to cut quite long strips as we cut because we've got the seam already sewn. So the instructions that we've been given, we need to cut strips that are 2 1/4 inches wide. So now I'm just going to measure it up and cut. Set that aside. Measure it up and cut. Now, if you have a ruler that is not long enough to go that full distance, what you can do is fold it so that those long edges of the parallelogram, or the bias edges of the parallelogram, are stacked on top of each other, and then measure it up. So I'm measuring 1, 2 1/4 inches. Oops. I've got a little bit of a divot in my table. So just each time you cut, just make sure that that cut edge is lined up nicely. And I might come over here. So again, 1, 2 1/4 inches, and I'm going to cut. So this little bit here is just a little bit of waste. And so now we've got 4 strips. They're bias strips cut at 2 1/4 inches. Now what we're going to do is join our strips end to end. So the way we do that, now just quickly, a personal preference of mine is actually to have these little bits, if I can manage it, at the end of this strip. So you can see that we've got the joins here and we've got the joins here at each end. So if I flip this over, I can then take this piece, spin it around, and then I can match up these edges. Now, what people will say is offset it by 1/4 inch like we did when we made the big square. I can't be bothered with that, honestly. So what I do is, let me just move this. If you have a gridded mat, it's fantastic. I'm just going to line up one edge of one strip with the horizontal line, and then I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to line up this edge with a vertical line. And so I'm going to just pin these in place. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler and a pencil, or a fabric marker if you're not naughty. And I'm just going to rule a line from the inner corner here to the inner corner here created by the fabric. Probably very hard for you to see that, but there's a little line from corner here to corner here. Now I'm going to go and sew that. What you can do though is, if you're in a rhythm, is for the next piece, what you do is you flip this strip so that the correct side is facing up. And then we're going to take the piece with the join that's sort of in the middle, and again we're going to swing it around. So I'm going to stack this up against this horizontal line, and I'm going to take this guy, this strip, and I'm just going to line this up with the horizontal line. As best I can. Let's see if this will mark the fabric better so you can see. There we go. So, actually what I might do is mark that over here, because this will probably be very visible. This is where a fabric marker comes in handy. There we go, that's better, you can probably see that. So I've gone from inner corner to inner corner, and I've marked a line for sewing or stitching. going to do the same here this time, so I can just see it. It'll be look a little bit nicer. I'm going to go inner corner to inner corner. Now I'm going to continue with that, and then I'm going to take it to the machine and stitch. You don't really need to back stitch if you're using a short stitch length. Something like a 2 or a 2.2 is enough. You don't need to back stitch. And you're just going to sew from the inner corner down to the inner corner. And you're going to do that for all the joins. I've sewn those seams now. I'm going to clip them apart. Get rid of the thread tails. And what we're going to do now is we're going to measure 1/4 inch from our stitch line and just trim that seam allowance. I also find, oops, if you get rid of these little triangles here as well, when we open it up, we've got a fairly smooth, oops, maybe not on that occasion, strip. Measure it up, trim it off. Trim those little triangles away. Do the same here. Okay. So now I'm going to go over to the iron, press my seam flat, then press my seam allowances open. So what we have now is one long continuous strip of bias binding. I like that I have these little 2 bits at the end because usually these are trimmed down. And now I just wanted to show you, there may be occasions, so see in this occasion there's a little bit of a divot between one joining the other. That doesn't matter, that's within our 1/4 inch of a seam allowance when we actually go to attach this and bind this, so I'm not too worried about that. If this difference was bigger, then I'd be concerned and I'd probably unpick that and re-sew that before trimming down the seam allowance and pressing the seam allowance open. But that difference is about 1/8 inch. So I'm okay with that. And that's how you make a strip of bias.